Settle in, and let the noise of your day slowly drift away. This is your time now, a time for stillness, for quiet, and for gently wandering through the distant corridors of the past. Tonight, we'll take a slow, meandering journey into the strange and uneasy life of the medieval court jester, a figure wrapped in bells, wit, and contradiction. If you're new here, and you find comfort in these calm journeys through history, consider subscribing when you're ready. Let me know in the comments where and when you're listening. Are you winding down after a long day? Drifting off under a warm blanket? Or perhaps just letting the soft hum of history keep you company? Wherever you are, I invite you now to dim the lights, quiet your thoughts, and allow the soft rhythm of the past to carry you gently towards sleep. In the great stone halls of medieval castles, beneath banners bearing the colors of kings and the glint of flickering torchlight, there stood a man many called a fool. Yet for the man who wore the bells and carried the bauble, the symbolic mock scepter of jesters, there was rarely anything foolish about the life he led. To the audience, he was comedy and chaos, the spark of mischief in an otherwise solemn world of duty and decorum. But beneath the colorful garb, the wide grin, and the biting wit was a man who walked a tightrope of danger, decorum, and despair. It was no easy fate to be the jester, and far from the carefree clown of modern imagining, the court jester of medieval Europe was often a prisoner of his own performance, bound to entertain or suffer the consequences. The role of a court jester was one of contradiction. At once revered and ridiculed, he had the ear of nobles yet the status of a servant. He might jest beside the throne, speaking truths no others dared to whisper, yet he did so at his own peril. The jester's humor had to be sharp enough to delight but dull enough to avoid offense. One wrong word, one ill-timed joke, and the sane court that once roared with laughter could fall silent with judgment, or worse, command punishment. In a time when kings ruled by divine right and pride was a deadly currency, to offend a monarch was not merely a misstep, it could be treason. From the moment a jester was chosen, often in childhood, sometimes because of a physical difference or exceptional wit, he was molded into a symbol of laughter, no matter the cost. His appearance became his brand: garishly colored tunics, mismatched patterns, donkey-eared hats, bells that jingled with every movement, and boots curled at the toe like a question mark at the end of a sentence. These were not clothes for comfort, nor for dignity. They were uniforms of absurdity, designed to signal his status before he even spoke. His every step was meant to amuse, even when his heart was heavy or his body tired. There was no space for sorrow in a fool's routine, only the relentless demand to perform. A court jester's day began not in leisure, but in anticipation. He was expected to observe the mood of the court, read the faces of nobles, and tailor his performance to suit the shifting winds of favor. A joke that pleased yesterday might fall flat today. Laughter was currency, and he needed to earn it daily. He had to be improvisational and clever, often performing songs, stories, acrobatics, and impressions, sometimes all at once. In some courts, jesters were expected to keep records of noble affairs through satire, presenting court gossip as comical anecdotes. Yet in doing so, they walked a fine line. To tell too much truth was to risk offense. To tell too little was to bore. Either could lead to punishment or dismissal, and for many jesters, that meant a life of poverty or worse. Despite their role as entertainers, jesters were often expected to serve in moments far darker than merriment. During executions or public punishments, some jesters were ordered to mock the condemned or keep the crowd amused while grisly acts were carried out. In times of war, a jester might ride with his lord to the battlefield, not to fight, but to offer morale through laughter in the face of death. He was both mascot and morale officer, summoned to sing or mock or juggle in the cold shadow of conflict. To be a jester was to perform even when horror stared back. And while the jester may have had access to the king's presence, a rare privilege in feudal society, that access was a double-edged sword. It was not unusual for jesters to be used as messengers or scapegoats. Kings could hide behind the jester's humor, using him to test reactions to unpopular opinions. If a joke criticizing a tax or nobleman was met with laughter, the king might know he could push forward. If it was met with outrage, the jester alone might suffer the consequences. In this way, jesters became political tools, often without their consent, weaponized by rulers who found it easier to hear the truth when it came with a smirk. Privacy was another luxury jesters were often denied. Living within or near the court, they were expected to be on call at all hours. A nobleman's whim could summon the jester in the dead of night. Whether the lord desired a bawdy tale or a riddle to distract him from insomnia, the jester had no choice but to obey. Refusal could mean punishment, and in some cases, public humiliation. There were stories of jesters who were beaten, imprisoned, or exiled for failing to amuse, sometimes even executed when their performance offended. The bells on their hats were not just ornamental. They were reminders that they were property of the court, owned in spirit if not in law. The jester's isolation extended beyond the walls of the castle. In villages and towns, he was rarely treated as an equal. Common folk viewed him with suspicion, sometimes fearing that his jokes carried secrets, or that his presence was an omen. While some admired the jester's quick wit or musical skills, others saw him as little better than a trickster or a madman. He was too strange to be embraced by peasants, too low to be respected by nobles. Trapped between classes, the jester had no true home. Then there were the personal sacrifices. Many jesters were denied families or romantic companionship. Their role demanded that they remain singular and available, unencumbered by distraction. Others were mocked for their appearance, especially those who were chosen because of physical deformities, dwarfism, or mental conditions, as was cruelly common in some courts. They were celebrated not for their personhood, but for their perceived oddity, their uniqueness turned into spectacle. It was a life where one's very body became the joke, a prison of flesh and performance. Even the tools of a jester's trade could become symbols of torment. The bauble, that comical scepter often topped with a caricature of the jester's own head, was both a prop and a mockery. It reminded the fool of his role, a puppet holding a puppet, each grin echoing the other. His songs and stories were expected to be original, yet not too original. Subversive enough to entertain, safe enough to keep him alive. He was the court's outlet for irreverence, the vessel through which nobles could experience the thrill of rebellion without risk. Yet for the jester there was always risk. Despite all this, many jesters took pride in their craft. Those who survived long enough to gain favor could become trusted companions to kings, even advisors in moments of crisis. There were tales of jesters who used their positions to nudge rulers toward compassion or warn them of dangerous paths. Their influence, though subtle, could be profound. But for every famous jester who earned a place in history, there were dozens forgotten. Men who danced and sang and jested until their voices gave out, their names lost in the echo of laughter that was never truly theirs. And so, the jester rose each day to wear his bells and his painted grin, stepping into the great hall to face the gaze of those who ruled his fate. He bowed, he spun, he told his tales. The nobles laughed, and sometimes the king smiled. But beneath it all, the jester remained alert, attuned to every breath and glance, every twitch of a brow. For he knew that in this life, laughter was not only his art. It was his armor. And when the laughter stopped, he was no longer a performer. He was a risk. Before a jester ever set foot in a royal hall or earned the laugh of a king, his path was often shaped by hardship, not ambition. Few children dreamed of growing up to be jesters. It was not a profession chosen, so much as assigned, sometimes through misfortune, sometimes through difference, and occasionally through raw, uncanny talent. But for many, the journey into jesting began with a gaze from someone powerful, someone who saw in a young child not a full human, but an opportunity for entertainment. In the earlier centuries of medieval Europe, especially during the 12th and 13th centuries, the idea of the jester evolved from earlier traditions of minstrels, mummers, and fools who entertained at festivals and in traveling troupes. Some had talent for song, for mimicry, for contortion, or for storytelling, and this made them valuable. But the court jester, the one who lived under noble roofs, was often not recruited from the ranks of celebrated performers. More commonly, he was selected from society's margins. Children born with dwarfism, physical deformities, or cognitive differences were sometimes given to noble houses as curiosities, tokens of status wrapped in a veil of charity. Others, with a natural wit or a strange way of speaking, were seen as novelties, ripe for molding into a living ornament of amusement. Training began early. A child who caught the attention of a lord or lady might be placed under the tutelage of an older jester, or left to learn through trial and error. There were no formal schools, no standardized curriculum. What passed for training was often a brutal immersion into performance. He would be taught to sing loudly, to juggle clumsily at first, to imitate the voices and manners of his betters without ever offending them too directly. He was taught rhymes and riddles, many of them bawdy or biting, that he would later be expected to deliver with just the right balance of timing and restraint. Laughter was the goal, but not laughter that upstaged the king, or bruised the pride of a sensitive baron. Every jest had to land like a feather, never a dagger. But the boy, still young and uncertain, would stumble. He might trip over a pun, forget a nobleman's favorite phrase, or mistake the right moment for the wrong one. For these failings, there was no gentle correction. A slap, a public scolding, a night without supper, these were the lessons he received in place of encouragement. And yet he endured, because jesting was not merely a job. For many of these boys, it became their entire identity. Removed from families, raised among servants and scornful knights, they learned early that they were different, and that their survival depended on their ability to amuse. As he grew older, the jester in training learned the deeper arts of subtext and subtlety. He practiced making observations about the court, its politics, its hypocrisies, without stating them plainly. Through allegory and farce, he could mock a failing crop, a failed marriage, a failed policy, all while hiding behind metaphor. A rooster who crows too loudly in the morning, he might say with a sly smile, will find himself alone by noon. And with that, a noble might laugh at the humor, while another wondered if the barb was meant for him. The jester's survival often hinged on ambiguity. He must always be funny, but never too clear. His costume, the jester's motley, became another layer of performance. From his youth, he would grow used to the prickly fabric of mismatched colors and itchy wool, the tight collars and absurd hats, the shoes that curled like snails and flopped when he walked. These garments made him instantly visible, marked him out as different, a beacon of strangeness amid the solemn grays and dark browns of the court. He might be laughed at the moment he entered the room, long before he opened his mouth. This too became part of the training, learning to smile while being laughed at, to bow while being belittled. Some were not merely trained to speak and joke, but to tumble and perform physical feats. Acrobatics, fire-eating, and dangerous stunts became part of the act, particularly in courts that grew bored of cleverness alone. A young jester might spend hours practicing handstands on stone floors, spinning hoops, or balancing daggers on his fingertips. And all of it came with risk. Broken bones, burned hands, or permanent injuries were not uncommon. There was little sympathy for failure. If a jester fell during a performance, it might earn a chuckle. If he could not continue, it might earn him replacement. Those who did not come into the role through training were often born into it. In rare cases, a child born to a jester could inherit the position, passed down like a family craft. This was more common in later centuries, when certain families became known for producing fools of high quality, jesters with well-practiced routines, memorable catchphrases, and the ability to navigate the dangerous waters of court politics. For these children, there was no illusion of choice. Their future was fixed, and they were judged by the shadow of their parents' reputations. Outside the court, in the villages and towns where they might have been born, the life of a budding jester was shrouded in misunderstanding. To common folk, a child taken to the castle to become a fool was not always pitied. Sometimes it was seen as a stroke of fortune, an escape from famine or toil. But others whispered darker stories, that jesters were cursed, that their jokes came at the price of their souls, that to make nobles laugh was to sell one's dignity. Such rumors only deepened the isolation of the young jester, who often found himself cut off from the world he once knew. Language, too, became a tool and a trap. The young jester was expected to learn the dialects and accents of the regions his lord dealt with, to mimic a French noble, an Italian merchant, or a Scottish rebel on command. He learned proverbs, songs, and phrases from other tongues, twisting them into riddles and puns. But fluency was never the goal, only performance. He was not a scholar, merely a mirror, reflecting what others wanted to see. This mimicry could sometimes offend those he copied, especially if his impressions were too accurate. More than once in medieval records, jesters were struck or punished for imitating a nobleman's stammer or regional lilt too closely. And yet they were expected to do it again the next day. There were rare instances when a jester in training was given formal lessons in music, especially in courts that valued lute players or flute solos. But again, the purpose was not art, but entertainment. His playing was meant to amuse, not to move the soul. A jester who played too beautifully might be seen as self-important. A jester who wept during a ballad might be accused of insubordination. The court demanded levity, not depth. So the young musician learned to keep his heart separate from his hands. By the time the jester reached adulthood, if he made it that far, he was no longer merely a performer. He had become a vessel for others' amusement, a walking contradiction dressed in bells and grief. His voice was sharp, but his tongue was chained. His face was expressive, but his heart was masked. The boy who once asked questions now gave answers and riddles. The child who once cried at injustice now turned it into punchlines. And through it all, there lingered a quiet knowledge that behind the court's laughter, there was no applause waiting for him. No embrace. No thanks. Only the expectation that he would rise again the next day, ready to juggle, ready to tumble, ready to spin stories that made others forget their burdens, even as he carried his own. Within the thick stone walls of the medieval castle, life unfolded in a strict rhythm dictated by rank, ritual, and routine. For the lords and ladies, there were formal meals, courtly ceremonies, and moments of pageantry. For the servants, there were endless tasks of cleaning, fetching, and attending. But for the jester, life was a strange in-between, not quite a servant, never a noble, and certainly not free. His world was one of constant vigilance, where every step could become a performance, and every glance might carry the weight of unspoken expectation. To live within the castle was to be both present and invisible, always seen, but never quite acknowledged as a full person. The jester's chambers, if he had a room of his own at all, were often tucked away in the less noble parts of the castle. Unlike the richly adorned quarters of knights or the cozy spaces of favored attendants, the jester's room might have been a cold, drafty alcove near the kitchens or tucked between service corridors. Some jesters slept in shared servants' quarters, while others were given barely furnished cells with a simple straw mattress, a wooden stool, and a small chest to keep their gaudy clothes and props. There was little comfort in these spaces. The walls were damp, the floors uneven, and the air thick with the smells of stone, ash, and old fabric. Waking each morning, the jester had no schedule of his own. He existed to serve the mood of the court, which could shift with the rising of the sun or the arrival of a moody nobleman. If the lord had slept poorly, the jester might be summoned before breakfast to offer a joke or a mimicry of yesterday's folly. If the lady of the house was bored of her embroidery, the jester might be asked to sing an improvised ballad about her needle and thread. The request came without warning, and refusal was not an option. Even the briefest hesitation could be interpreted as arrogance, laziness, or defiance. In a world where reputation ruled, the jester's survival depended on his readiness, not only to perform, but to perform well at all times. There was no set mealtime for the jester. He ate when allowed and often from what remained after others had dined. His meals might consist of crusts, stew scraps, or a heel of cheese tossed his way by a scullery maid in a hurry. If he was favored that day, he might be invited to dine near the noble's table, not at it, of course, but close enough to deliver a clever line between bites or amuse the guests between courses. Yet even in these moments of proximity to power, the jester was constantly aware of his place. He was there for their amusement, not his own nourishment. His plate was a privilege, not a right. The great hall, with its long wooden tables and high ceilings, became his stage. There were moments of silence between courses, or during lengthy feasts when the guests began to grow restless, and this was the jester's cue. He would step forward, clad in his mismatched costume and jingling cap, his voice rising above the murmurs of the crowd. Sometimes he delivered a rehearsed tale. Sometimes he improvised a bawdy joke. Other times he recited a parody of a recent event, the arrival of a pompous ambassador, the misstep of a clumsy squire, or the romantic blunder of a lesser noble. These performances were often met with laughter, but the jester never laughed too loudly himself. His role was to provoke laughter, not to share in it. To laugh as they laughed would be presumptuous. To forget his place would be dangerous. Beyond the performances, the jester's duties could vary widely. In some courts, he was expected to accompany the lord on hunting trips, where he would ride alongside armored knights, jingle with every hoofbeat, and offer witty commentary on the day's pursuit. In others, he might be asked to entertain children, telling exaggerated fairy tales or staging puppet shows with crude wooden figures he carved himself. Occasionally, he would be called upon to deliver messages, some private, some public, in a way that softened their blow. A nobleman might send a jester to inform another that he had been insulted at dinner, using humor to veil the seriousness of the offense. In this way, jesters became tools of communication, diplomacy, and even manipulation. When court was held, those formal sessions where justice was dispensed, disputes were aired, and alliances forged, the jester sometimes stood nearby, offering humorous commentary or performing between proceedings. But this visibility was a double-edged sword. If he mocked the wrong person, or made light of a verdict that was meant to be taken seriously, he could be reprimanded or punished. More than one historical account records jesters who were flogged, dismissed, or even imprisoned for an untimely joke. To be so close to power was not protection, it was exposure. Outside of performance, the jester's presence was tolerated at best. He was rarely invited to the quiet moments of court life, the poetry readings, the planning councils, the romantic walks through the gardens. He might wander the corridors unnoticed, or be shooed away by guards if he lingered too long near the private chambers. Even among servants, he was often an outsider. While they had their own hierarchy and camaraderie, he occupied a strange space above and beside them, with access they envied but a role they did not respect. He did not clean, cook, or serve. He entertained, and that, in their eyes, was neither noble nor useful. There were occasional moments of kindness. A gentle noblewoman might offer him a new ribbon for his costume. A stable boy might share an apple. But these gestures were rare, and often came with a note of pity or condescension. No one envied the jester. His life, colorful as it seemed, was one of constant strain. He was expected to be cheerful at all times, even when ill or grieving. The death of a friend, a family member, or even a fellow servant could not exempt him from performance. The show, as they say, had to go on, and for the medieval jester, that was not a comforting phrase, but a binding rule. Punishment was always a possibility. If the jester failed to amuse, he might be denied food or locked in a storeroom overnight. If he offended someone of rank, he might be forced to apologize in public, sometimes by groveling, other times by performing a humiliating task. There are records of jesters being made to wear donkey ears, walk on all fours, or even mimic animals as a form of chastisement. One particularly cruel punishment involved the jester being tied to a rotating spit like a roast, spun in mockery while the court laughed. These episodes were not hidden. They were part of the spectacle. Even his suffering was meant to entertain. And yet, the jester endured. He learned to read faces, to anticipate moods, to sense when a joke would land and when it would wound. He developed an uncanny emotional intelligence, born not of empathy alone, but of survival. In a way, the jester became the emotional barometer of the court. His success depended on his ability to reflect, redirect, and regulate the feelings of those around him, a skill more complex than any swordplay or strategy meeting. But no matter how adept he became, he was never allowed to rise above his station. The ceiling above the jester was made not of stone, but of expectation. He could see it every day, in the way nobles laughed at his words but ignored his advice, in the way servants stepped around him without greeting, in the way children giggled when he stumbled, mimicking the adults who raised them. As the sun set and the torches were lit, the jester returned to his chamber, alone, often sore from tumbling or hoarse from speaking. He might practice a new riddle by candlelight, or repair a torn sleeve in his costume. Some kept journals, hidden beneath their beds, where they wrote thoughts too dangerous to speak aloud. Others stared into the flickering shadows, letting their minds drift to what might have been, had they been born a farmer, a soldier, a scholar. But for most, the past was a closed door. There was only tomorrow, and the promise of more laughter. Not for them, but for others. To live in a castle as a jester was not a dream. It was a gilded cage, painted in bright colors and lined with bells. It was a place where laughter echoed against stone, but rarely touched the heart that created it. And each night, as the hall emptied and the fire dimmed, the jester curled beneath his thin blanket and listened to the silence. A silence he could never truly enjoy, because he knew, with certainty, that the next day would demand his voice once more. In a world where power was sacred and dignity fiercely guarded, the jester's art was perhaps the most dangerous of all. While soldiers risked life and limb in battle, and merchants wagered their fortunes at sea, the jester gambled with something far more precarious: the pride of kings. His weapon was wit, and his battlefield was the ego of the elite. Every quip, every mimicry, every sly joke carried with it the possibility of offense. The jester's skill was not only in crafting laughter, but in knowing just how much truth could be hidden within a jest before it became a threat. To mock was to tread a razor's edge. In the safety of the tavern or the village square, a well-timed insult might draw howls of laughter and a round of drinks. But within the court, mockery could topple reputations, spark vendettas, or invite punishment. The jester was expected to satirize, to poke fun, to jest, but never to bruise the pride of those who held the power to ruin him. It was a balancing act so delicate that few could sustain it for long. And yet, it was the very heart of his role. Mockery came in many forms. There was physical mimicry, the exaggerated limp of an aging nobleman, the fluttering gestures of a vain courtier, the exaggerated swagger of a pompous knight. These imitations, when timed well and framed as harmless fun, could delight a crowd. But when done too accurately, or in the presence of the wrong person, they could quickly sour. The jester had to read not only the room, but the moment. Was the target laughing too? Was his laugh genuine, or was it forced? Would he laugh again tomorrow, or stew in embarrassment and plot revenge? The jester could never be certain. His survival often hinged on an instinct that bordered on supernatural, the ability to sense when the mood was shifting beneath the surface. There was verbal mockery too, often laced with clever wordplay and subtle references. A jest about a noble's spending habits might be framed as a tale of a goose who laid golden eggs but couldn't stop buying new feathers. A critique of a poorly planned war might be wrapped in a fable about a blind rooster leading a pack of wolves. The smarter the joke, the safer it was, because only the cleverest among the court would understand it fully. But that safety was an illusion. If even one person decoded the satire and took offense, the jester's words could become a noose. Historical records and literature offer glimpses of these tightrope acts. The famous jester Triboulet, who served in the court of King Francis I of France, once mocked the king's mistress so sharply that he was sentenced to death. However, the king, amused by the fool's wit, allowed him to choose the manner of his execution. With characteristic daring, Triboulet replied that he wished to die of old age, and the king, laughing, pardoned him. But not all jesters were so lucky. Many faced imprisonment, beatings, or exile for jokes that fell flat or cut too deeply. There were even cases where jesters were executed, often without trial, their deaths written off as accidents or justified by vague claims of treasonous speech. The danger was heightened when the court was tense. After a failed harvest, a lost battle, or a political scandal, the appetite for humor became more volatile. The jester might be called upon to lighten the mood, to make the court forget its troubles, even if only for a moment. But the risk of saying the wrong thing, of misreading the atmosphere, was exponentially greater. A joke about food in the midst of famine might seem tasteless. A jab at a general after a lost campaign could be seen as unpatriotic. In these moments, the jester's job was not only to entertain, but to heal wounds without touching them directly. It was a task that demanded artistry, empathy, and unerring precision. Even the delivery of mockery mattered. A jester could often get away with more if he framed his jokes as self-deprecating. By making himself the butt of the joke, he could smuggle in criticism of others. He might tell a story of a fool who spent his last coin on a painted chicken, only to discover it was made of wood, and then slyly add, "Though I've known lords who bought castles just as hollow." The laughter that followed might be at the expense of a wealthy noble known for his poor judgment, but the joke would be cloaked in enough absurdity to shield the jester, at least temporarily. Sometimes, the jester was given license to say what others could not. Kings valued jesters precisely because they could speak uncomfortable truths without causing open discord. In a world where sycophancy was common and honesty rare, the jester's mockery could serve as a kind of release valve. He might mock a greedy advisor in front of the court, giving voice to what others silently thought. In doing so, he helped preserve the illusion of justice, that the court could laugh at its own flaws, even if it never addressed them. But this function was deeply manipulative. The jester was a vessel through which criticism could be aired and dismissed in the same breath. He made injustice funny, and by doing so, helped it endure. Not all nobles appreciated this arrangement. Some were thin-skinned, jealous of their reputations, and easily provoked. A jester who offended such a man might find himself blacklisted from certain banquets, or forbidden from making jokes about particular subjects. In extreme cases, he might be accused of slander or subversion. The irony was sharp. The jester, whose job was to speak freely, was often the most carefully watched man in the room. His words were dissected, repeated, and remembered, not always for the right reasons. The danger of mockery extended beyond speech. Even a look, a gesture, or a dramatic pause could be interpreted as disrespect. If a jester paused too long before delivering a punchline about a nobleman, it might suggest hesitance, or worse, doubt. If he rolled his eyes, even subtly, it might be seen as insubordination. He had to control his entire body, mastering not only the art of movement, but the art of restraint. His every motion was scrutinized for hidden meaning. There were also written jests, poems, short plays, and satirical songs that jesters composed to perform at seasonal festivals or royal celebrations. These works allowed for more elaborate mockery, with multiple characters and veiled commentary. But they also carried greater risk. Once something was written down, it could be read by others, misinterpreted, or used as evidence. A satirical poem that poked fun at the Queen's taste in fashion might be recited in the hall with laughter, then whispered about in the corridors with offense. The jester might be called to explain himself, a task for which there was no safe answer. To claim it was a joke was to risk sounding dismissive. To admit intent was to confess insolence. The highest form of mockery, and the most dangerous, was satire aimed at the crown itself. Few jesters dared tread this ground, and those who did often did so only after years of loyal service. Even then, the margin for error was vanishingly small. A joke about taxes, about royal mistresses, or about failed policies had to be disguised so thoroughly that even the king might not realize it was about him. And if he did, he had to be in a forgiving mood. But there was always an audience that understood, the common people. Tales of clever jesters who tricked kings and mocked lords became folklore. Songs were sung in taverns about fools who spoke truth to power. These stories rarely ended well for the jester, but they struck a chord. In them, the fool became a hero, the only one brave enough to say what everyone knew, and the only one who paid the price. He became a symbol of resistance, of courage, of the cost of honesty. But for the jesters who actually lived these stories, there was little comfort in such legacy. They did not seek to be martyrs. They simply wanted to survive another day. In this way, mockery became a kind of quiet rebellion, a way to expose hypocrisy without igniting open conflict, a way to highlight absurdity while bowing before it. It was both powerful and powerless, liberating and constricting. The jester was not a clown. He was a mirror, reflecting the court's flaws in a distorted but revealing light. And every time he held that mirror up, he risked having it shattered over his head. At the end of the day, when the laughter faded and the torches burned low, the jester returned to his quarters not with the satisfaction of a craftsman, but with the exhaustion of a survivor. He might replay his jokes in his mind, wondering which landed, which failed, and which might come back to haunt him. He knew that laughter was fleeting, but grudges lingered. And so he lay awake in the quiet dark, his jester's cap folded neatly beside him, his voice silent at last. But in his mind, the mockery never stopped. It was his gift, his curse, and his only shield in a world that demanded humor, and offered little in return. The relationship between a jester and a king was unlike any other in the medieval court. It was intimate, but not equal. Familiar, but never truly safe. While others addressed the monarch with bowed heads and careful words, the jester might trade banter with him, call him by name, or even dare to tease him in front of his court. But beneath this informality lay a brutal truth: no matter how favored the fool, he was always just one breath away from punishment. To amuse the king was to live another day. To bore him, or worse, offend him, was to risk everything. And so, the jester walked a lonely path, both cherished and expendable, playing a role so subtle that it often blurred the line between friendship and servitude. Kings valued their jesters not only for entertainment, but for insight. In a world ruled by flattery and fear, where nobles rarely spoke truth and courtiers were careful to echo only the king's desires, the jester's candor stood out. Cloaked in humor, his observations could carry truths no one else dared voice. A wise king recognized the usefulness of this. A foolish one mistook it for insolence. But even the wisest monarch held the power to punish on a whim, and jesters knew it. The throne was both their stage and their scaffold. The closer they stood to it, the more carefully they had to dance. A jester in favor might be granted liberties unthinkable for others. He could enter the king's private chambers unannounced, interrupt a council meeting with a rhyme, or toss playful insults during a banquet. Some jesters even rode beside their lords during hunts or sat at the foot of the throne during audiences. But these privileges were never guarantees. They depended entirely on the king's mood, and the mood of the court around him. A jester who had the king laughing one day might find himself scolded the next for a joke taken the wrong way, or for making the wrong person feel slighted. The court was a nest of rivalries and shifting alliances, and the jester, though apolitical in title, was always tangled in its web. Much of the danger stemmed from the jester's proximity to raw power. In some ways, he knew the king better than most. He observed him in private moments, heard his mutterings, witnessed his tempers. The jester saw the human side of the monarch, the doubt behind the crown, the weariness behind the decree. But he was not allowed to acknowledge it openly. To suggest that the king was anything but divine, confident, and right was taboo. So the jester learned to reflect without revealing, to advise without admitting, to speak truth in riddles and disguise care as comedy. He might say, "My lord, a horse that never rests will break its own legs," when the king had overworked himself. Or, "A tree too proud to bend snaps in the storm," when a policy had brought unrest. In these metaphors, the king could hear concern without accusation. But even so, the jester always braced for a rebuke. There were kings who adored their jesters, treating them as confidants, playmates, or even surrogate sons. They gave them gifts, rings, robes, even titles of mock nobility. But these gifts came with strings. They were reminders of favor, but also of dependence. A ring from the king was a symbol of approval, but it could just as easily be taken away. The jester was never allowed to forget that his status depended on laughter. His value was tied not to who he was, but how well he performed. If he aged, if he lost his edge, if a newer, funnier jester came along, he could be cast out as easily as he had been raised up. There are stories, some factual, some embellished through folklore, of jesters who grew too bold. One famous tale tells of a jester who, during a feast, dared to impersonate the king in voice and manner. The court howled with laughter, but the king's smile faded quickly. Offended by the likeness, he had the jester stripped of his bells and locked in a dungeon. 4 days he remained there, forgotten, until the queen intervened and begged for his release. When he returned to court, he walked with a limp and never imitated the king again. Such tales were cautionary reminders. The throne had no equal, not even in jest. Some jesters, however, managed to forge deeper bonds with their monarchs. They used their position to influence policy or advise in subtle ways. A clever jester might point out a corrupt official by mocking his greed in a song. Another might prevent a war by lampooning the folly of rash vengeance. Their insights, though delivered with a grin, were sometimes the clearest voices of reason in a court drowning in sycophancy. But such influence was fragile. If the king grew paranoid or was swayed by jealous courtiers, the jester could find himself accused of manipulation, treachery, or simply being too familiar. Even in the best relationships, there was a ceiling. The jester was never truly a friend. He was property, a living ornament of the court. His presence was tolerated as long as it brought amusement. If he became a burden, or if the king changed, the bond could break overnight. A new queen might dislike his humor. A war might sour the king's appetite for comedy. A political scandal might make his jokes too risky. In such cases, the jester could be dismissed without cause, forced into exile, or worse, quietly executed to avoid embarrassment. The emotional toll of this precarious bond was profound. The jester had to smile and laugh with the man who held his life in his hands. He had to appear carefree, even when he was afraid. He could never afford to look anxious or resentful, for fear it would be seen as ingratitude. So he became a master of masks, not only the physical ones used in skits, but the invisible mask of constant cheer. He wore it every hour of every day, until it became indistinguishable from his face. Over time, this duality could erode the soul. The jester who once found joy in making others laugh might come to dread each performance. The delight in his cleverness might give way to exhaustion. He could never complain. He could never break character. And if he ever forgot himself, if he ever dared to be just a man, not a fool, the court would recoil. They wanted the jester, not the person behind him. His humanity was invisible behind the bells. Still, the jester endured. He studied the king's moods like a scholar studies scripture. He learned when to speak and when to remain silent. He kept records in his mind: who laughed at which jokes, who bristled, who nodded thoughtfully. He adjusted his act accordingly, ever the chameleon. In doing so, he became not only a performer, but a politician of sorts, navigating personalities, factions, and hidden agendas, all while pretending not to notice any of it. And sometimes, in rare and fleeting moments, the jester saw something real in the king's eyes. A flash of amusement not tainted by power. A sigh that betrayed loneliness. A look that said, "You see me, don't you?" In those moments, the jester felt something like connection. But he knew better than to believe in it. It was part of the performance, just like everything else. A moment of shared laughter, and then the curtain fell. When night came and the halls grew quiet, the jester returned to his small chamber, removed his cap, and sat alone. The king would retire to velvet and warmth. The courtiers would whisper behind closed doors. And the jester, once again, would be left with his thoughts. He might replay the day's jokes in his mind, wondering if one had gone too far. He might imagine a day when he no longer had to perform, when he could laugh or cry without consequence. But such dreams were luxuries he could not afford. In the world of kings and jesters, power was everything, and laughter was the currency that bought survival. The jester knew this better than anyone. He lived by it, breathed it, and shaped his entire identity around it. But deep inside, he also knew that one day, the laughter would fade. And when it did, he would have nothing left: no titles, no land, no legacy. Just the memory of a voice that once made kings smile, and the silence that followed when they no longer needed it. Outside the court, beyond the stone walls and tapestries and echoing laughter of nobles, a very different world existed, a world of dirt roads, wooden cottages, market stalls, and peasants who labored from dawn until dusk. This was the world of the common folk, and in their eyes the court jester was an odd and distant figure. Not quite a noble, not truly a servant, not a warrior, not a craftsman. He was something else entirely. A walking contradiction dressed in garish clothes, capable of entertaining kings yet lacking all the dignity that such proximity implied. And so, to the outside world, the jester was often regarded with a mixture of awe, suspicion, ridicule, and sometimes fear. When a jester appeared in a village, either accompanying a royal procession or traveling for a festival, he drew attention. Children might stare at the bells on his hat, the swirl of colors in his tunic, the strange way he moved as if every gesture were part of a performance. Adults watched too, though more cautiously. They had grown up with tales of jesters who whispered secrets, who mocked good Christians, who consorted with kings but never worked an honest day in their lives. To them, the jester was more than an entertainer. He was a reminder of the strange rules of the upper world, where laughter was a tool of power and words were more dangerous than swords. The peasantry lived hard, repetitive lives, and they rarely had the energy to reflect on satire. They understood humor, of course, crude jokes, riddles, funny songs passed down through generations. But the jester's humor often carried layers, references to nobles they had never seen, or ironies too deeply embedded in court life to resonate in the fields. When he performed for villagers, he had to adjust, becoming broader in his antics, louder in his songs, clumsier in his tumbling. And even then, the laughs were not guaranteed. The people respected simple jesters, those who juggled or danced or made amusing animal sounds. But those who tried to be clever, who used big words or lofty ideas, were met with suspicion. They seemed too close to the lords, too far from the soil. In some places, jesters were thought to be bewitched. The idea that a man could mock a king and live was unsettling. Was he protected by magic? Did he hold secrets? Did he have the ear of the monarch, whispering things that affected taxes, land, or law? These questions bred unease. A jester might be watched carefully as he passed through town. Some would cross themselves. Others would whisper behind his back. If something unfortunate happened, a sudden illness, a fire, a failed crop, the presence of a jester nearby might be blamed. His laughter, after all, was unnatural. Too loud. Too constant. Laughter that did not come from joy but from duty. That, to many, was not laughter at all, it was something else entirely. Clergy were especially wary of jesters. In churches and monasteries, the jester represented the spirit of irreverence. He made fun of those in power, often including bishops and abbots. He spoke in riddles and rhymes that could confuse the simple and mislead the devout. Some jesters even mocked religion outright, weaving parodies of sermons into their routines or making light of biblical stories. The more cautious jesters avoided such topics, especially in deeply pious courts, but the reputation remained. Preachers warned their flocks about the dangers of jesters, men who twisted words and morals, who made sin seem funny and holiness seem dull. They were described in sermons as tempters, corrupters, and sometimes even as demonic figures in disguise. Despite this, some commoners admired the jester. They saw in him a strange kind of hero, someone who lived without toil, who defied authority in jest, who seemed to have freedom no one else did. There were stories of jesters who insulted barons to their faces, who exposed corruption through song, who turned the king's own words against him, and lived. These tales spread through markets and taverns like wildfire, growing with each retelling. The jester, in these stories, was not a fool but a trickster, a clever underdog who used humor to strike at the mighty. He became a symbol of resistance, especially in times of hardship, when taxes rose and harvests failed. "If only we had a jester brave enough to mock the Lord's steward," some would say, half in jest themselves. In truth, jesters had little freedom. Their humor was carefully calculated, their performances constantly measured. They were not rebels, but survivors. Still, the myth persisted. And it gave them a strange sort of protection, or exposure. A jester who walked into a new town might be treated like a celebrity or a threat, depending on the mood. Some were welcomed with cheer, invited to perform, offered drink and coin. Others were turned away at the gate, told to move along, or even pelted with stones. It was a lottery of reputation, and jesters never knew which version of themselves the world had heard. There were jesters who traveled more often than others, those who served minor lords, or who had been dismissed from court but continued to perform in cities and fairs. These men were often lumped in with traveling minstrels, mummers, or charlatans. They set up stages in public squares, offered riddles for coin, juggled knives or ate fire. They called themselves jesters, but without a court to validate them, they were seen as little more than entertainers. And yet they still carried the echoes of their former lives, the courtly phrases, the refined tricks, the polished mimicry. Some even bragged of having once served a king, though no one could verify it. These former court jesters lived a hard life, full of rejection, illness, and instability. The public's laughter was all they had left, and they chased it like a flickering candle in the wind. The idea of the jester also appeared in art and literature. Manuscripts occasionally depicted them in the margins, twisted figures with oversized hats and leering smiles, sometimes playing with animals, sometimes dancing on the backs of demons. They were rarely portrayed with dignity. Instead, they were symbols of folly, of chaos, of the world turned upside down. In morality plays, the jester was sometimes a tempter, other times a fool who learned a hard lesson. But always he stood apart, never the hero, never the villain, always the one who watched, commented, and faded. Among the nobility, jesters were spoken of with mixed emotions. Some lords considered them useful, others distasteful. To have a jester was a mark of wealth. It showed that one's court was lively, that one could afford not only guards and cooks, but laughter. But a poorly behaved jester, or one whose humor crossed the line, could bring embarrassment. Noble guests might whisper about a jester who mimicked a visiting ambassador too accurately, or who recited a limerick about the queen's cousin that struck too close to truth. Such missteps could damage alliances. And so, jesters were often kept on a tight leash. They were free to speak, but not too freely. They were invited to perform, but not to linger. Jesters themselves internalized all of this. They learned to adapt, to be more bawdy in the market, more clever at court, more reverent near the clergy, more subversive with the common folk. They became chameleons of performance, shifting their tone and persona to match the crowd. But in doing so, they often lost a stable sense of self. Who were they, really, beneath the jokes? A man who made nobles laugh, peasants mutter, and priests frown? A relic of a system that found amusement in pain? A voice of reason cloaked in absurdity? Perhaps they were all of these things, or none of them. The truth is that the world never truly knew what to make of the jester. He was too strange to fit into any one category, too useful to discard completely, too dangerous to trust entirely. And so, he remained on the edge, a figure of mystery and mirth, respected and reviled in equal measure. He walked through fields and castles, through feast halls and back alleys, always watching, always smiling, always ready with a joke. But behind that smile was a tired heart, a mind worn thin by the constant dance of perception. And when he passed away, as all jesters eventually did, his name was rarely carved into stone. His costumes were packed away or given to the next fool. His jokes lived on in stories, retold without credit, reshaped for other times. The world moved on, laughing still, forgetting the man who once carried that laughter on his back. Every profession has its tools. For the blacksmith, it was hammer and anvil. For the knight, armor and sword. For the merchant, scale and scroll. And for the jester, whose craft was laughter under pressure, satire and shackles, his tools were stranger, more symbolic, and in many ways, more revealing of the burden he bore. His was a trade not of metal or numbers, but of mood. His tools did not forge weapons or wealth, but protected him from disfavor and death. To understand the jester's life was to understand the things he carried, wore, and wielded in the service of his uneasy craft. The most recognizable of the jester's possessions was his costume, and it was no mere outfit. It was a uniform, a declaration, and a prison all in one. Known as the motley. The jester's clothing was deliberately mismatched, a chaotic patchwork of bright colors, often red, yellow, green, and blue, sewn together in loud, asymmetrical patterns. Each shade served as a signal. In a world where most people wore earth tones and wool in simple cuts, the jester's garb was a walking joke. It announced his role before he ever opened his mouth. He could not blend in, not even in the dimmest corner of the castle. His appearance guaranteed attention, and that attention came with a cost. The fabric of the motley was rarely comfortable. Though some jesters in wealthier courts received finer cloth, most wore scratchy wool or stiff linen dyed in harsh pigments that irritated the skin. The design of the outfit varied across regions and periods, but certain features remained common. The tunic split into dual colors down the middle, leggings in opposing hues, and exaggerated elements like long sleeves, dangling points, and tassels. These were meant to emphasize movement. When the jester danced or tumbled, the fabric came alive, swirling in a way that amused the eye. But offstage, these flourishes became a burden. They snagged on furniture, dragged in dirt, and marked the jester even when he wished to be unseen. Then there was the hat, perhaps the most iconic piece of all. Called the fool's cap, or simply the cap and bells. It was often three-pronged, each point tipped with a bell, though some had two or even a single crest depending on local fashion. The points were meant to mimic donkey ears or a coxcomb, and their purpose was more than ornamental. They jingled with every movement, announcing the jester's presence even before he entered a room. In a court where silence could be golden, this was both a feature and a curse. The jester could never truly sneak, never truly rest, never blend into the background. The bells ensured he was always on display, always heard, even when he wished otherwise. Attached to the jester's belt or carried in his hand was the bauble, also known as the merit, a mock scepter often topped with a miniature head resembling the jester himself. Sometimes carved from wood, other times crafted from cloth or papier-mâché, the bauble was both a prop and a mirror. It allowed the jester to speak through a second voice, to deliver lines with the suggestion of distance. "He says you're too proud," the jester might say, wagging the bauble toward a nobleman, pretending the insult came from the puppet, not himself. But no one was fooled. The jester's voice was always his own, and the bauble was merely a tool of deflection, a thin layer of protection from reprisal. Other props filled the jester's world. He might carry juggling balls or pins, rings, or flaming torches. Some had drums, lutes, or fiddles strapped to their backs. Others used puppets, masks, or scrolls filled with rhymes and riddles. These objects were not just accessories, they were essential. Each one expanded the jester's range, added variety to his routine, and gave him options when the mood of the court shifted. A jester who relied solely on spoken jokes could quickly bore an audience. But one who juggled while singing a parody of the king's speech, or who performed a shadow play about court gossip, might hold attention longer, and live longer. Maintaining these tools was part of the jester's unseen labor. Costumes tore and had to be patched, often by the jester himself late at night in his small chamber. Bells fell off and needed replacing. Props broke or wore down and had to be repaired with whatever materials were available. There was rarely a dedicated tailor or assistant for the jester. He was expected to be self-sufficient. And if his costume looked shabby, or his bauble uninspired, it reflected poorly not only on him but on the court that kept him. In this way, even his appearance was a performance, constantly maintained under the pressure of judgment. But the greatest burden of all was not in what the jester wore or carried, it was in the constant performance of joy. His smile was his armor, his voice his currency. He had to look amused, enthusiastic, and quick-witted at all times. Even when exhausted. Even when ill. Even when grieving. There are accounts of jesters who performed during plagues, who danced with fever in their blood, who cracked jokes while mourning family they could not afford to bury. Their tools might distract the eye, but they could not protect the heart. The real performance was internal, a tireless act of hiding pain behind painted cheer. There was also the matter of personal hygiene and grooming. While nobles had barbers and perfumers, jesters often had to fend for themselves. Yet they were expected to appear clean, colorful, and well-kept. Their hair might be curled or cut in strange styles to match the character of their persona. Their faces sometimes painted, not like actors on stage, but with subtle flourishes that exaggerated expressions or added absurdity. A jester with missing teeth or a crooked nose might lean into those features, turning them into comic assets. But those same features, once the laughter faded, often marked him for ridicule rather than recognition. And then there were the invisible tools, the things a jester had to cultivate within. Memory, for one. He had to remember dozens of jokes, stories, songs, and routines, rotating them in new combinations to avoid repetition. He had to memorize the names, faces, and gossip of the court, adjusting his performance to who was present. Improvisation was vital, the ability to respond in real time to insults, requests, or sudden changes in mood. One moment he might be singing, the next juggling, the next mediating a tense moment with a well-placed pun. His mind had to move constantly, even when his body ached from the previous night's tumbling. And beneath all of this, there was fear, the ever-present companion of every jester. Fear of saying the wrong thing. Fear of being too funny or not funny enough. Fear of being replaced. Fear of aging. Fear of being forgotten. The jester carried all this silently, behind the bells and the grin, never showing it, never naming it. For to admit fear was to seem weak. And weakness in a jester was fatal, not always in body, but in career, in dignity, in purpose. The tools of the jester, then, were not just instruments of humor. They were extensions of his identity. Each one served a purpose beyond its surface. The costume marked him. The bells warned of his presence. The bauble gave him a second voice. The props bought him time. The routines earned his supper. Together, they created the illusion of freedom, the appearance of a man who could say what others could not, do what others would not. But in truth, they were chains. Not heavy like the irons in a dungeon, but no less binding. They told the world who he was, and who he would always have to be. At the end of the day, when the jester removed his hat and folded his tunic, when he set his bauble aside and extinguished the candle, he sat alone among the very objects that had kept him alive, and had kept him from being seen. These tools, so bright and strange and full of noise, were the only things between him and obscurity. They were his protection, his livelihood, and his burden. And as he lay down on his thin mattress, the bells silent at last, he might whisper one last joke to himself, not to amuse, but to remember who he was beneath it all. A man. Just a man. With aching hands, tired feet, and a soul too full of other people's laughter to remember the sound of his own. In a world ruled by divine right and unchallenged hierarchy, humor was a volatile force, too powerful to be left completely unchecked, yet too valuable to discard. The medieval jester was allowed, even encouraged, to speak freely in a world where few others could. But that freedom was never absolute. It was conditional, fragile, and closely watched. The jester performed under invisible chains, hemmed in by unspoken rules and shifting moods. Every joke was weighed, every word judged, every laugh scrutinized for hidden insult. This was not comedy in its purest form. It was humor shaped by fear, sharp, clever, and constantly self-censored. Jesters lived under a peculiar kind of censorship. There were no official rulebooks or written statutes telling them what they could and could not say. Instead, they were expected to know instinctively, to feel the boundaries in their bones, to sense the unspoken rules of courtly life, and to tread carefully. This knowledge was learned through experience, observation, and, often, through painful missteps. A jester who mocked a noble's failed campaign might be flogged. One who imitated the king too closely might lose his position. Another who told a joke about a bishop's wealth might be hauled before a church tribunal. The lesson was always the same: freedom of speech was a performance, not a right. This kind of censorship was more dangerous than overt prohibition. It created uncertainty. Without knowing the rules in advance, jesters were constantly forced to guess what might be considered acceptable, and what might land them in disgrace. They had to read the room with surgical precision. A jester might perform the same routine in 2 different courts and receive wildly different reactions. What earned him praise one night could lead to silence, scorn, or even punishment the next. There was no safe material, only safe delivery, and even that could turn on a whisper. The boundaries of humor in the medieval court shifted with politics, religion, and personal vendettas. When tensions were high, during wartime, famine, or succession disputes, jesters were expected to be more careful. The court did not want to be reminded of its own fragility. Jokes about the king's age, the queen's inability to produce an heir, or the treasurer's missing coin could all become explosive topics overnight. Even gestures, glances, or pauses could be interpreted as disrespect. A jester who once made people roar with laughter might be accused of insolence simply because he held eye contact too long or failed to bow quickly enough. Religious topics were especially perilous. While some jesters were known to lampoon church figures or poke fun at biblical tales, these jokes were often walking a razor's edge. The church wielded tremendous power in medieval society, and its clergy were not known for their tolerance of satire. A jest that seemed harmless in the context of a feast might be interpreted differently the next morning. There are records of jesters being called before bishops to account for their words. Some were fined. Others were imprisoned. Still others vanished from records entirely, presumed exiled or worse. The jester was expected to know how far he could go, and when to stop short of blasphemy. Even satire aimed at the court's enemies could backfire. A jester might create a parody about a rival kingdom, only to find that a marriage alliance was being negotiated in secret. Suddenly, the very joke he was praised for yesterday became a diplomatic liability. In such moments, the jester was blamed for his lack of discretion and punished to preserve appearances. He was useful until he became inconvenient. Then he was cast aside without hesitation. To manage this uncertainty, jesters developed strategies. One was ambiguity, telling jokes that could be interpreted in multiple ways. A jester might tell a story about a greedy goose who stole from his neighbors, allowing the audience to decide whether the goose represented a real person or not. Another tactic was to speak through allegory or metaphor. Rather than criticizing a tax directly, he might tell a fable about a tree that sheds too many leaves and leaves the forest bare. The message was there, but buried deep enough to offer plausible deniability. If confronted, the jester could always claim it was just a story. Another strategy was to play the fool so convincingly that nothing he said could be taken seriously, or rather, that anything serious he said could be dismissed as accidental. Some jesters deliberately adopted personas that appeared slow-witted or absurd, exaggerating their foolishness to protect themselves. If they delivered a biting truth, they could smile vacantly and feign ignorance. "I did not know the rooster in my tale sounded like the steward, my lord," he might say. "I merely thought him a silly bird." In this way, foolishness became a shield, a disguise that allowed for sharper commentary. Still, even these strategies had limits. The line between subtlety and obscurity was thin. If a joke was too vague, it fell flat. If it was too obvious, it invited wrath. And there was always the risk that someone in the audience, a jealous noble, a pious advisor, a paranoid monarch, would interpret the joke in the worst possible way. Jesters lived in fear of such people. One complaint from the wrong person could undo months or years of careful reputation. Even a single whisper, "He meant that line for the king, didn't he?" could spark suspicion, investigation, or dismissal. Punishments varied widely depending on the court and the offense. Some jesters were docked pay, denied meals, or given humiliating tasks. Others were beaten, imprisoned, or publicly ridiculed. The irony was brutal. A man who had made others laugh for a living might one day become the object of forced laughter himself. There are records of jesters being forced to parade through town wearing mock signs of shame, or to perform apologies in costume before the very nobles they offended. Some were stripped of their outfits, their bells torn off, their baubles burned. The symbolic stripping of a jester's tools was often more painful than the physical punishment. It was not just a reprimand, it was an erasure of identity. In the most extreme cases, jesters were executed. These cases were rare, but they happened. A joke about a succession dispute, a mocking song about a battle loss, a drunken jest about royal infidelity. Any of these could be construed as treason, especially if the court was already unstable. And treason, in most medieval kingdoms, was punishable by death. The jester might be hanged like a thief or beheaded like a traitor. No special mercy was given for his former services. His role had always been conditional, and once he crossed the line, that condition was revoked. There were jesters who tried to push back against censorship. Some argued their case directly to the king, pleading for the right to speak freely. Others attempted to defend their jokes with logic or historical precedent, citing older fools who had said worse. But such efforts were rarely successful. Logic had little place in the world of courtly offense. Emotions, pride, and reputation ruled all. A joke was not judged by its content alone, but by its reception, and by who was listening. Over time, many jesters learned to censor themselves before anyone else could. They pruned their routines, avoided dangerous topics, repeated only the safest jokes. Their performances became blander, their voices quieter. Some retired early, choosing to leave the court rather than live under constant scrutiny. Others burned out slowly, their eyes dimming behind the forced smile, their once sharp wit dulled by fear. The laughter they had once enjoyed became hollow. The applause felt cold. And yet they continued, because they knew no other life. Because the world outside the court held even fewer promises. In rare cases, a jester's reputation could protect him. If he had served for many years, if the king truly favored him, he might be given more room to speak freely. But even then, the leash remained. It was simply longer, not absent. The jester always knew it could be yanked at any moment. And so he laughed, and danced, and spoke his riddles, carefully, cleverly, always watching. At night, when the torches dimmed and the stone walls cooled, the jester returned to his quarters and exhaled. He thought back over every line he had said, every look he had received. He replayed moments of tension, wondering if he had gone too far. He wondered who might be whispering about him even now, which noble had furrowed their brow too long, which clergyman had left without clapping. These thoughts lingered long into the dark. Sleep came slowly, and never deeply. Because in the morning, it would all begin again, the smiling, the measuring, the guessing, the censoring. In this way, the jester's life was shaped not only by what he said, but by what he didn't. His silences were as calculated as his words. His pauses were performances in themselves. He learned to dance between the lines, not out of joy, but out of necessity. And when he finally grew too old to balance it all, too tired to mask his worry, too disillusioned to perform, he was quietly replaced. The bells passed on to someone younger. The audience laughed anew. And the fool who once held the court's attention disappeared, remembered only in rumors, stories, or not at all. There is a quiet truth that settled over every jester eventually, a truth too heavy for laughter to lift, too painful to turn into a joke. No matter how clever, beloved, or indispensable he had once been, the jester would not be remembered. There would be no statue in his honor, no heraldry stitched with his name, no family coat of arms passed to sons or nephews. His life, full of color and sound, ended in silence. Once the laughter stopped, so too did his place in history. And yet he had given everything, his voice, his wit, his energy, his years, to the service of those who would forget him the moment he fell silent. The jester's decline often began quietly. There was no announcement, no ceremony, no graceful farewell. One day, his jokes didn't land quite as sharply. His voice cracked when he sang. His knees ached from too many tumbles on cold stone floors. His timing, once impeccable, began to falter. He would forget names, fumble the punchline, or arrive a heartbeat too late to catch the court's attention. At first, the nobles chuckled politely. The king might still smile. But underneath the laughter was discomfort, not at the jokes, but at the decline itself. They did not like to see the jester age. It reminded them that joy, like youth, was temporary. A younger jester might appear, perhaps as an assistant, a novelty, a temporary replacement, while the older man rested from illness. The court, craving novelty, welcomed the new fool's energy, his fresh rhymes, his daring impressions. At first, the older jester pretended not to mind. He had seen newcomers come and go. But this time felt different. The boy was good, too good. The courtiers began requesting his performances. The king laughed longer. The steward clapped harder. The torchlight shifted to someone else. And the old jester, still wearing the same motley he had patched a dozen times, stepped back, smiled, and bowed. The bells on his hat did not jingle as brightly. Their sound was tired. There were no pensions for jesters. No retirement villas. No guaranteed rest after a life of service. In some courts, an aging jester might be allowed to stay on as a quiet presence, helping train his replacement, tending the animals, or doing light chores. But this mercy was rare. More often, the jester was dismissed gently. A bag of coin. A few kind words. Perhaps a tunic from the king's wardrobe, meant as a token of respect. And then the gates opened, and the jester walked out, no longer a fool, but not quite a man. He had no trade, no land, no family waiting. He had been a performer all his life. And now the stage was gone. Some tried to continue performing in the towns. They joined traveling players or performed in village squares. But without the crown behind them, they were just another wandering entertainer, indistinct, sometimes mocked, often ignored. Their style, once perfectly tuned for courtly humor, now seemed strange and out of place. The peasants didn't understand their metaphors. The merchants had no time for their riddles. And the children, though they laughed, often lost interest. The jester, once the centerpiece of noble banquets, now competed with bear-baiters, fire-eaters, and tooth-pullers in the muddy streets of market towns. The laughter he once commanded now had to be begged for, and it came less often. Others faded into obscurity entirely. They removed their motley and bells, dressed in plain tunics, and disappeared into the countryside. Some became beggars. Others sought shelter in monasteries, where their performances were unwelcome, but their silence was accepted. A few found work as tutors or scribes, leaning on their memory and skill with words. But even in these new roles, they were haunted by echoes of their past. They missed the court, not for its splendor, but for the purpose it gave them. To make others laugh had been more than a job. It had been an identity. And once that identity was taken away, there was little left. The idea of legacy haunted many jesters in their final years. They had seen nobles die and be remembered in stained glass and family trees. They had seen knights carved into stone above their tombs, their deeds recited for generations. Even cooks and builders left behind something, a recipe, a wall, a story. But what did a jester leave? A joke? A memory? And even that would fade quickly. Nobles did not record the names of their fools in official ledgers. Chroniclers rarely mentioned them unless they had committed some scandal, or died in a memorable way. Their lives were erased by time, overwritten by the next fool to wear the bells. There were exceptions, of course. A handful of jesters earned fame that endured, fools like Tribolet in France, Nasreddin in the Islamic world, or Will Summers in Tudor England. Their names survived in stories, some apocryphal, others exaggerated. But these were the rare few, the exceptions that proved the rule. Most jesters were anonymous, known only in their own time, and then forgotten. Their stories, if they lived on at all, were absorbed into folklore, stripped of names and context. They became characters, not people. Archetypes, not individuals. Their real lives, full of hardship and compromise, were lost beneath the laughter they once created. Some jesters tried to create legacies. They kept journals, wrote poems, carved small figures, or composed songs. But few of these works were preserved. A jester's writings were rarely valued as literature. His art was ephemeral, meant to be heard once and forgotten. Unlike monks or nobles, he had no scribes to copy his work, no patrons to protect his creations. If he died with a book beneath his pillow, it was likely burned, sold, or used as scrap. His thoughts, his reflections, his private truths, all vanished with him. There were no funerals with fanfare. No processions. If a jester died in court, his death might be mentioned over supper, a brief toast, perhaps a joke in his memory. If he died alone, there might be no one to mark the day. His costume, once bright and lively, might be folded and placed in a chest, waiting for the next fool to arrive. Or it might be burned, the bells melted down, the bauble discarded. The performance ended. The stage cleared. The audience moved on. This lack of legacy was perhaps the greatest cruelty of all. The jester had shaped his life around others, their moods, their needs, their laughter. He had bent himself into knots to please them, risked his safety to amuse them, suppressed his own feelings to serve them. And yet, in the end, he was nothing more than a memory, and not even that for long. The kings he had entertained might be buried beneath marble. The castles he had filled with laughter might still stand. But he himself was dust, unmarked, unnamed, unmissed. And yet, despite it all, many jesters never stopped performing. Even in old age, even in exile, even in poverty, they found ways to make others smile. They told stories to children by firelight. They played songs in the square. They recited old rhymes under their breath as they walked the roads alone. Not for applause. Not for coin. But because it was who they were. Because the laughter, once given, never truly left them. Perhaps that, in the end, was their true legacy. Not a name carved in stone, but a ripple, a laugh that echoed through time, passed from one mouth to another. A joke that survived in the telling, even if no one remembered who first told it. A story shared in whispers, that made someone smile in the dark. The jester's life was hard, thankless, and lonely. But for a moment, a fleeting, fragile moment, he brought joy into a world that desperately needed it. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Though the image of the medieval court jester is most often associated with the castles of Western Europe, with their stone halls, velvet-draped thrones, and heraldic banners fluttering over battlements, the role of the fool was far from unique to the lands of England, France, or the Holy Roman Empire. The concept of the comedic servant, the licensed truth-teller, the professional provocateur, could be found in courts and palaces across the globe. Yet in each place, the jester was shaped by local customs, beliefs, and social structures. And while some were treated with a measure of respect, many others endured lives marked by exploitation, risk, and ultimate invisibility, a shared fate that transcended borders and languages. In the courts of Renaissance Italy, fools were known as buffoni, and their performances were often more theatrical than their northern counterparts. These jesters leaned heavily on commedia dell'arte, a form of improvised theater featuring stock characters, exaggerated physicality, and masked expression. The buffoni might take on the persona of the zany, a dim-witted servant, or the boastful capitano. Italian jesters were expected to be skilled actors, trained in movement, mimicry, and comic timing. Their humor was bawdy, biting, and often very physical. But behind the laughter was the same sharp edge. One mistake, one insult that landed too forcefully, and the performer could find himself dismissed or disgraced. Even amid the theatrics, the boundaries remained strict. Farther east, in the royal courts of the Ottoman Empire, the role of the jester took on a more cerebral character. Known as Muthasler or court fools, they were often employed to offer comic interludes during state banquets or religious festivals. Yet their role went deeper than mere distraction. Ottoman jesters were often trained in philosophy, poetry, and history. They were expected to entertain not just with physical comedy or mimicry, but with riddles, parables, and double meanings. Their jest had to be clever enough to amuse the intellectual elite, but never so daring as to offend the Sultan or his advisors. And while some rose to become trusted companions of high-ranking officials, their position was still perilous. A misjudged phrase could be seen as disrespect to Allah, the Prophet, or the empire itself. In Persia, the tradition of the court fool dated back centuries, often blending with the role of the poet or the Sufi mystic. These jesters, sometimes known as dalkaks, could wear bright clothes and perform ridiculous acts, but they also carried a spiritual role. Their foolishness was, in some cases, a mask for divine insight. Within the Sufi tradition, the figure of the fool became a vessel for hidden wisdom, a man who appeared simple or mad, but whose words revealed deep truths. These fools danced on the edges of society, revered and mocked in equal measure. Their jests were riddled with allegory, often used to critique worldly vanity or challenge corrupt authority, but always in ways that allowed for plausible denial. The dalkak who insulted the vizier might say he was only speaking of a character in a dream. But the meaning was clear. In China, court jesters existed as early as the Zhou dynasty, and were sometimes known as yuan, or humorous people. These performers could hold surprising influence, especially if they won the emperor's favor. One of the most famous was Yu Zi, a jester during the reign of King Zhuang of Chu. According to legend, Yu Zi once made a bold joke at the king's expense, pointing out the absurdity of a royal command. Rather than being punished, he was praised, and later entrusted with sensitive diplomatic tasks. But for every jester who found success, there were many more who did not. Chinese courts, highly structured and deeply hierarchical, did not tolerate those who disrupted harmony. A jest that hinted at political instability or questioned the emperor's virtue could be seen as a direct challenge to the mandate of heaven. The punishment was often severe, and mercy was rare. In the Indian subcontinent, the role of the fool existed in multiple traditions, most notably in Sanskrit drama and court storytelling. The Vidishaka, a stock character in classical Indian theatre, was the comic companion to the noble hero, often portrayed as foolish, gluttonous, or cowardly, but possessing a unique license to criticize kings and nobles through humor. The Vidishaka spoke in a different dialect from the other characters, using regional slang, malapropisms, and wordplay to break the fourth wall and connect with the audience. While fictional, this theatrical fool mirrored real-life court performers who filled similar roles, using comedy to soften political critique and provide catharsis. These performers walked a fine line, protected by tradition but vulnerable to changing tastes or temperaments. In West Africa, griots, the storytellers, historians, and musicians of the court, sometimes filled the role of jester, especially when performance required satirical edge. While griots were deeply respected as keepers of oral tradition, some among them used humor to weave morality tales or gently rebuke rulers through symbolic language. The jester-griot hybrid might sing a song about a lion who lost his teeth because he roared too often, a clear metaphor for a boastful king. Such performances were tolerated when they amused, but the danger of overstepping remained. Even in the far north, among the icy courts of the Norse sagas, the fool appeared. He was less a court fixture and more of a campfire satirist, a skald who might mix song with insult in the mead halls of chieftains. Viking humor was sharp, often cruel, and layered with personal rivalry. A clever insult might earn admiration or start a blood feud. The line between jester and warrior was blurred, and mockery was a test of status, not just performance. A skald who dared insult the wrong man might find himself challenged to a duel, or killed outright. Despite the vast geographic and cultural differences among these jesters, a common thread ran through them all: the illusion of freedom. No matter how clever, witty, or favored they were, jesters were rarely truly safe. Their job was to walk along the edge of a blade, to make rulers laugh without ever wounding them. They had to be subversive but loyal, entertaining but non-threatening, bold but deferential. And when they failed, when their humor misfired or their satire cut too deep, they paid dearly. The price of misjudging a laugh was often their career, their safety, or their life. The tools of their trade varied: masks in one place, hand puppets in another, musical instruments in a third. Their languages, customs, and audiences were different. Yet their burden was the same. They were expected to be the conscience of the court without claiming moral authority, to expose hypocrisy without causing offense, to humanize rulers without ever seeming their equal. It was a role filled with contradiction, one that demanded emotional intelligence, instinct, and courage in equal measure. In some places, especially outside Europe, the fool was given a slightly higher status. He might be seen as a mystic, a trickster figure connected to the spirit world, or a voice for the people. But even then, his status was conditional. He was still beholden to the ruler's whim. He could still be exiled, punished, or killed. Reverence could turn to scorn overnight. Travelers and chroniclers occasionally wrote about these foreign fools with a mix of fascination and misunderstanding. European observers visiting Persia or India noted how different the jesters were, more poetic, less slapstick, more philosophical. Eastern chroniclers sometimes described European jesters as crude or boorish, lacking the refinement of their own traditions. Yet in both cases, the writers failed to see the hardship beneath the humor. They saw the surface performance, not the years of careful calibration, the constant anxiety, the invisible boundaries. Today, the idea of the jester survives in different forms: the satirist, the political cartoonist, the late-night comedian, the clown. But in the medieval and early modern world, across continents, being a fool was not an indulgence. It was a profession, one fraught with danger, contradiction, and sacrifice. The jester abroad was no freer than the jester at home. He served his ruler, bent to the needs of his audience, and performed beneath the ever-present gaze of judgment. And so, across deserts and forests, mountains and rivers, in marble palaces and wooden halls, the fool danced, sang, juggled, and joked, not because he was free, but because he was bound. Not because he was safe, but because he was needed. And when he faltered, he was replaced. His name forgotten. His costume passed on. But for a time, his voice filled the air, and his laughter bridged the silence. And that, in every land, was the life of the jester. Among all the visible burdens a jester carried, the colorful costume, the ever-ready wit, the careful balance of boldness and submission, there was another weight far heavier, and far less seen. It was the silence that followed the laughter. The quiet moments when the hall emptied, the torches dimmed, and the echoes of amusement faded into cold stone. It was in those hours, when the audience was gone and the bells stopped jingling, that the jester was left with the one thing his performance had always tried to cover: his loneliness. To be a jester was to live among others, but never with them. He was everywhere and nowhere. Present at every feast, every celebration, every solemn gathering, yet always slightly apart. His place at the table was never quite secure, his chair never quite permanent. He was a voice among voices, yet his words were not treated like the others. He was not a counselor, though he offered advice. He was not a noble, though he stood beside kings. He was not a servant, though he took commands. He was a fixture, a novelty, a function. And as such, he belonged to no one, not even to himself. The noble court was a world of alliances, rivalries, whispered intrigues, and rigid ranks. Everyone had their place, their kin, their retinue. The jester had none. He was often without family, sometimes by choice, more often by circumstance. Many had been taken young, adopted into courts not for love, but for utility. Others had left behind their kin, either cast out for their strange demeanor or pulled away by opportunity. And once in the court, there was little time or space to build bonds. Everyone around him was either above his station or wary of his proximity to power. Even among servants, he was treated differently, not with cruelty, but with cautious distance. That distance was born of confusion. Was the jester powerful, or not? He could speak freely, freer than most, and he had the king's ear. He joked about nobles to their faces. He saw and heard things others did not. But he also slept in a small room, wore ridiculous clothing, and danced for food. His role was too strange to categorize. As a result, he was often left out of the natural flow of courtly life. Not invited to private conversations. Not asked for company. Not included in quiet moments around the fire. He was welcome only when the performance was needed, and forgotten when it wasn't. For some jesters, this distance grew into bitterness. They became prickly, sarcastic, mocking everyone around them with a sharpness that shielded their own aching. Others turned inward, withdrawing into their thoughts, becoming quiet when not on stage. A few found solace in drink, using ale or wine to dull the sting of isolation. And some, the rare few who still believed in companionship, tried to form bonds. They befriended stable boys, cooks, squires. They offered jokes as gifts, sang lullabies to sleepy children, or helped carry water in exchange for brief conversation. But even then, the friendship was fragile. A wrong joke, a shift in favor, or a jealous glance could sever it. Romantic companionship was another rare blessing, and often a complicated one. Some jesters, particularly those born with deformities or those perceived as mentally different, were never seen as desirable partners. They were laughed at, not looked at. Desired only when it was safe to do so, or when the act itself was meant to be a joke. For others, the costume became a wall. People could not see past the motley. They saw the jester, not the person. And for those who did form romantic attachments, secrecy was often required. A noblewoman's dalliance with a jester could cause scandal. A servant who favored the fool might be reprimanded. The jester, once again, had to hide behind the mask, even when his heart was full. Some jesters found companionship among animals. A dog that followed him from performance to performance. A cat that curled beside his bed at night. Birds he sang to in the early hours of morning. These creatures did not care for status. They did not flinch at costume or question intent. To them, the jester was simply a presence, warm, steady, occasionally kind. It is no surprise that many historical jesters are depicted with animals in later artistic renderings. Not just as props, but as quiet companions in a life where human closeness was rare. There were moments of connection, fleeting and fragile. A queen who smiled kindly after a performance. A child who giggled and tugged at the jester's sleeve. A knight who clapped his shoulder after a particularly clever rhyme. These moments mattered. They stayed with the jester long after the candles burned out. He replayed them in his mind like favorite lines of a song, whispered them to himself in empty corridors, remembered them on cold nights when no one called his name. But such moments, however cherished, were never sustained. They belonged to the performance, not to the man. The loneliness of the jester was unique. It was not the loneliness of a hermit, nor that of the outcast. It was the loneliness of being always near others, but never truly known. Of being heard constantly, but never listened to. Of being remembered for how you made others feel, but not for who you were. The jester's voice echoed through halls, but it rarely reached hearts. And when it did, it was often misinterpreted, mistaken for satire when it was sincerity, seen as mockery when it was mourning. Even in times of personal loss, the death of a parent, the illness of a sibling, the quiet ache of aging, the jester was expected to perform. He could not wear black. He could not weep openly. His sorrow had to be hidden behind riddles. He might craft a story about a bird that lost its song, or a mirror that no longer reflected light. But no one would ask what it meant. They would laugh, applaud, and move on. The jester would bow, smile, and return to his room in silence. Some found outlets in writing, scribbling poems on scraps of parchment, keeping journals hidden beneath floorboards, composing songs they never sang aloud. In these writings, they spoke honestly. They wrote of fear, regret, longing. They named people they could not approach, recorded dreams they could never chase. But few of these writings survived. They were not preserved by the court. They were not considered valuable. When the jester died or was dismissed, the writings were burned, sold, or lost. Religious solace was another path some jesters explored, though it too was complicated. Many jesters were seen as too irreverent for the church. Their humor was sometimes deemed sinful, their mimicry blasphemous. Yet others sought comfort in chapel shadows, attending Mass from the back pew, speaking to the heavens in moments of solitude. They prayed not for fame or fortune, but for companionship, for peace, for understanding, for the laughter they gave to be returned, not in noise but in love. Despite this loneliness, many jesters remained devoted to their craft. They believed in the value of laughter. They knew its power, to ease tension, to bridge gaps, to offer relief. And they took pride in their work, even when it went unthanked. They saw themselves as servants not only of the court, but of humanity. They gave joy where there was gloom, mischief where there was monotony. And for a brief moment, each time they performed, they were not alone. The room looked at them. The people listened. The laughter, even if fleeting, filled the void. But once the feast ended, the audience departed, and the hall returned to silence. The jester was left again with his thoughts. The echo of his own voice, still bouncing off the walls. The scent of food he did not eat. The warmth of fire he did not sit beside. He would hang his costume, set down his bauble, and stare into the dimming candlelight, wondering if anyone had truly seen him. Wondering if, tomorrow, they would still laugh. Wondering if anyone would ever know the man beneath the fool's grin. As the centuries passed, and the great stone castles of Europe weathered with time, the image of the medieval jester began to blur into myth. He became a caricature, a silly man in colorful clothes, forever grinning, frozen mid-dance, balancing a bauble in one hand and a joke on his tongue. He was remembered more for the laughter he created than for the life he endured. But beneath that image was a much more complicated figure. The jester, though draped in motley and crowned with bells, was one of the most complex roles in the medieval world, part performer, part servant, part truth-teller, part scapegoat. He lived at the margins of society, and yet somehow stood at the very center of power. And when he vanished, he left behind no monuments, no heirs, and very few written records. But the echo of his work never truly disappeared. The jester served a purpose far greater than amusement. In a world governed by rigid hierarchy, strict etiquette, and unchallengeable authority, he was the only one allowed, and expected, to disrupt the rules. He interrupted, he ridiculed, he mimicked, and he questioned. All while smiling. He offered a strange sort of relief to those in power, allowing them to briefly laugh at themselves without consequence. He was a mirror, a pressure valve, a living commentary. And yet, his freedom was a performance. He was only safe as long as his disruptions were controlled, his critiques cloaked in comedy, and his antics perceived as harmless. To the king, the jester was both pet and weapon. He could be used to mock a rival, to test a reaction, to say what no one else dared. Yet if the joke was too accurate, or the mood too serious, that same jester could become a liability. This contradiction defined the jester's entire existence. He was useful but expendable, seen but not known, applauded yet always on edge. His proximity to power was both his privilege and his peril. No other figure in the court lived with such emotional whiplash, beloved one day, banished the next. But the jester was not only there for the king. He served the entire court, and beyond. His presence gave voice to the unsaid. His riddles disguised hard truths. His foolishness drew attention to real folly. To the noble who was puffed up with pride, he offered mockery. To the lady who whispered rumors, he offered parody. To the knight who boasted too loudly, he offered a well-placed pun. Each jest carried with it more than laughter. It carried reflection, however brief. And in those moments of performance, the jester held power. The kind of power that unsettled just enough to provoke thought, before quickly retreating behind a smile. The people beyond the court, too, began to mythologize the jester. His stories entered folklore, exaggerated, romanticized, reimagined. He became the clever underdog who outwitted the king, the sharp-tongued rogue who exposed corruption, the holy fool who revealed wisdom through nonsense. These stories were comforting. They offered a sense that even in a world as unfair as the medieval one, there was room for wit to triumph over wealth, for laughter to speak louder than law. But these stories also hid the truth. The real jesters were not always triumphant. They were not protected by cleverness alone. Many suffered. Many were punished. And most were forgotten. Still, the archetype endured, because the need for it endured. Every era has its jester. Not always in costume, not always by name. But somewhere in every system of power, someone steps into the role of the licensed fool. Someone who uses humor to reveal, to challenge, to endure. In that sense, the jester's legacy is not carved in stone, but carried in spirit. In every sharp-witted cartoonist, every satirical writer, every late-night comedian who walks the line between truth and trouble, the jester lives on. And yet, in the quieter moments, in the moments between performances, The real jester lived a very different story. His legacy was not one of laughter, but of labor. He worked endlessly to refine his art, adapt to new audiences, anticipate danger, and hide his own feelings. He sacrificed comfort, companionship, and often dignity. He survived not by being the loudest, but by being the most observant. He watched everyone. He remembered everything. His job was not just to speak, it was to understand. And in that understanding, he carried a burden that few acknowledged. The jester taught the world something without ever claiming to teach. He showed that humor is a tool, not just for fun, but for survival. That truth, when wrapped in laughter, can slip past even the most guarded hearts. That performance is often a mask for pain. That the loudest laughers are not always the happiest. And that the ability to make others smile is both a gift and a weight. His costume was designed to draw ridicule. His tools were seen as silly. But his role, when viewed clearly, was one of extraordinary complexity. He was part historian, part actor, part poet, part counselor. He memorized events, mimicked behaviors, distilled patterns into punchlines. He spun satire from scraps of overheard gossip. He crafted whole routines from glances, gestures, and slips of the tongue. And he did it all with the knowledge that one misstep could cost him everything. When the jester was gone, the castle did not fall silent. Another would come. Another would don the bells, take up the bauble, and start the dance anew. The cycle continued. But the people who had known the old jester might notice small things missing. A certain clever turn of phrase. A particular song. A look that carried both mischief and warning. These details faded quickly, replaced by the next fool's flair. And yet, in quiet moments, someone might recall a line, a laugh, a story, and feel, if only briefly, the absence of the man who once delivered it. He did not leave behind wealth. He did not leave behind lineage. But he left behind the echoes of his art, scattered in memory like the fading notes of a song. Unwritten, unrecorded, but somehow still alive in the rhythm of daily life. In the phrases people used. In the ideas they dared to think, now that he had made them seem safe. In the moments they caught themselves smiling and didn't know why. And so, the jester vanished not with a grand farewell, but with a bow. A bow that came after 1,000 performances. A bow that followed a life lived entirely in service to the amusement of others. He lowered his head. The bells on his cap gave a final jingle. The bauble dipped one last time. And then he stepped off the stage, quietly, completely, and without applause. His laugh, though, never truly ended. It remained, not loud, not sharp, but soft. Carried on stories. Hidden in sayings. Reflected in every moment when someone dared to speak truth in jest. In that way, the jester had the last laugh, not over his king, not over his court, but over time itself. And now, dear listener, the final bell has rung. The feast is over, the fire has faded, and the jester, ever loyal, ever overlooked, has taken his final bow. We've walked beside him through shadowed halls and candlelit chambers, through silence and song, through joy and burden. We've seen the truth behind the painted grin, the weight behind the laughter, and the man behind the mask. Thank you for traveling so gently through time tonight. If you've enjoyed this quiet journey into forgotten corners of history, feel free to subscribe, only if it feels right. And before you drift off, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? Let me know in the comments when your eyes finally closed. But for now, let the world grow still. Let the bells grow quiet. Let your thoughts float softly, like dust in torchlight. You are safe. You are resting. And history will wait for you until morning. Good night.